Okay, so it's a very heavy story. Just letting you know prior to hearing it, it's gonna get a whole lot darker before it gets a whole lot better. Um, have you ever had someone ask you, oh, tell me something about yourself, and you're just drawing a complete blank because there's nothing to really reach for? Well, for me, it's kind of the same, where instead of like telling someone some really interesting story about my life and how it's always so great, it's more so like, oh my gosh, what dramatic story did I get to bring up today? Um, it it stems from a lot of things, as trauma always does, but it eventually comes down to when I started comparing myself to others. I started realizing I live with it every day, and some people are like, oh, you get it for like a week or it comes and goes or something, and I was living with it as if it was the air that I breathe. And it starts as far back as one of the earliest memories I have is when I was 5 years old and I was just a little boy in Iraq growing up, and the US invasion began. And I remember being a young child, seeing people lose people in front of me, seeing people get burned in front of me, seeing people lose their loved ones, me myself losing loved ones. And as a 5 year old kid, you don't really think of those things. It happens and you think you're supposed to be sad, and that's it. You don't know how to process those things. So for me, as far back as I can remember as far back as my trauma allows me to. And having gone through that war and then living through it and getting past it, my family decided to move away from Iraq. So for a while there, we were jumping from one country to the other. We went from Iraq to Jordan to Syria to Iraq to Jordan again. And it was just, as a kid, have you heard of those military brats who are always getting moved around and always having to make new friends? That was me, except I don't know if there is such a thing as a refugee brat. So having to move every now and then, having to make new friends every now and then, having to live a completely different life every now and then, that was something that I thought was just, it was just my life's battle. It was something that was decided for me before I even got a chance to say. And then my father passed away. This was in 2007, and it was me, my three siblings, and my mother. And one of my father's wishes was that, ever since the US invasion, there was no future in Iraq anymore. So we had to go where the future was, and that was the US. And my mom, in honoring my dad's wishes, decided to bring me and my three siblings here. And we've been here since 2008. Now, my worst worry or fear before that was being physically harmed. Living in a war zone, you're like, oh, the worst thing that could happen to me is I could walk up to the grocery store and I could get shot or something. Then I come to the United States and I'm like, holy moly, that is not the case anymore. As a kid in 8th grade in science class, one time my science teacher asked a classmate of mine who was a black female. He asked her a question and she answered it incorrectly. So then he asked me and I answered it correctly, and he was like, oh, congratulations. And somehow, some way, that girl decided to say, oh, why don't you just go back to bombing, you terrorist? And so that was the first time that I've ever had someone use my own identity as an attack against me, when the worst that I thought that could ever happen to me was an actual physical attack. you know? So going through that, realizing that now I have to worry about racial discrimination based on my skin, based on being Muslim, based on being an immigrant, in addition to having lived through losing my father, and it was still very fresh. And in addition to having been a kid who's seen people die in front of him, and when you watch a horror movie and your friends are like, oh my gosh, that's a dead body, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's scary. Having lived through those things, it's just like, that's, I think, when it first started becoming normal to live with trauma. And then I went through high school and puberty and found out I was gay. And being gay in a Muslim family, that just doesn't happen, you know? So add that onto the trauma. From going from a kid who was traumatized about what happened to him to going to a kid who was traumatized in his own skin, his own body, and having to lie about it every single day of his life to his family, to his friends, to his whatever. The trauma took form in my sexuality at that time. And that took a toll. I've developed depression around that time. Didn't know it, but I did. And lost friends, didn't eat, developed eating disorders, multiple other things, you know, and just lived through it. Because if there was one thing that I learned when I was a kid in Iraq, it's not to live life, it's to survive it. So I survived. I survived through middle school, I survived through high school, and then I got to college and I'm like, no, this is not good, I need to live my life. Went through college and I was like, okay, straight A's, straight A's, straight A's, straight A's. And I did good. And then there was this one semester where I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't push it to the back of my head anymore. And I couldn't live a lie anymore. And I couldn't do any of these things anymore. And that's when I failed my first class ever. And that was the same day that I went to my doctor and was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Now, as you can imagine, having mental illness in a Muslim family with a very old school, traditional mother didn't go well either. So, I decided that I had to do what was right for myself. I started medication, went to therapy, did all the things that I needed to do. And things slowly but surely got better over time. You know, it was one of the weirdest things where, you know, you're expected to love yourself automatically or as if it's a given, but it's not true. It's not automatic, and you actually have to love yourself. And I didn't know that. I thought it was just always a thing because everyone always decided everything for me. Everything was always done for me. My mom, she always did everything for me. She always told me, oh, this is right, oh, this is wrong, etc., etc., etc. Everyone was like, oh, you're Muslim, so you must be a terrorist. Oh, you're gay, so you're a fag, etc., etc., etc. And so everything was always decided for me. I didn't have a say in it. So when I got to therapy, I had to speak for myself, and that was the most weird but most liberating feeling ever. And ever since that day, I have consistently been to therapy, and I have consistently been on medication, and things have been better. So things are good. And trauma is there, still there. But it doesn't define me anymore. It's not who I am. My identity as a person is not tied to it anymore. It's not a family member that I live with anymore. It's not what I breathe in and out anymore. It isn't who I am. And that's when I started seeing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that tunnel, it ends in me. And that light is in me. That light I might have lost sight of, but it didn't lose sight of me. I just had to fight through and find it again. And when I found my light again, it changed me. And it changed me for the good. Now, I'm not going to tell you that everything is good and peachy now. But there is someone in here, and he's actually fighting for who he is and who he wants to be. And that is something that I never had before. So what I want to do through this is, my story is here is so that anyone else, because I've experienced so much, and as just a 22-year-old, my story reaches out to so many, and it connects and relates to so many. Some people are genuinely shocked by some of it, and I've always thought it was just normal. But now more than ever, it's given me strength because it makes me realize that I can bring people together through it, and I can make people realize that they're not alone, unlike me, who thought he was alone in all this. And that has given me strength to fight for my light and to let someone else know that they don't have to lose sight of theirs. No matter how dark this world can be, we all can find our light, and that's something that has helped me fight through my trauma, because I realized that at the end of the day, I deserved it this time around. I deserved to fight for myself, not anyone else. That's that.